When CEO Victoria Sterling refused to shake the janitor's hand at the company gala, she thought she was protecting her reputation until her estranged daughter walked up to him and whispered, "Dad," shattering everything she thought she knew about power, pride, and the man she'd spent years looking down on. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story, and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear your story too. The black Bentley cut through the downtown traffic like a blade through silk, its polished exterior reflecting the city lights in streaks of gold and crimson. Victoria Sterling sat in the back seat, her posture rigid with the kind of control that had been carved into her spine through 20 years of boardroom battles and hostile takeovers. Her Valentino gown midnight blue with crystal beading that caught the light like scattered starshad cost more than most people made in 3 months. She knew this because she'd approved the budgets that determined those salaries. The driver eased to a stop beneath the gleaming entrance of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel, where a red carpet stretched from the curb to the towering glass doors like a river of expectation. Photographers clustered behind velvet ropes, their cameras already flashing at the steady stream of tech industry titans arriving for Sterling Dynamics' annual charity gala, Victoria's Gala. Her night to shine, to remind everyone in Silicon Valley exactly who commanded the highest tower in their digital kingdom. She waited not because she was nervous, but because timing was everything. Let them see her arrive, let them document this moment. The door opened with mechanical precision, and Victoria Sterling emerged like royalty stepping onto conquered ground. The cameras erupted in a symphony of clicks and flashes, and she moved through them with practiced grace, her smile calibrated to project warmth without accessibility, confidence without arrogance. It was a performance she'd perfected over decades, the delicate balance of being aspirational yet untouchable. "Ms. Sterling, over here." "Victoria, how does it feel to close the biggest quarter in company history? What's next for Sterling Dynamics?" She paused just long enough to let them capture the perfect shoulder hand resting lightly on her Hermes clutch, diamond earrings catching the light, the hint of a smile that suggested she held secrets worth knowing. Then she glided toward the entrance, her assistant Rachel materializing beside her like a shadow, tablet in hand, ready to manage whatever the evening demanded. The hotel's lobby had been transformed into something from a fairy tale, but one written by accountants and marketing executives. Towering arrangements of white orchids and silver branches created a forest of elegance, while strategic lighting bathed everything in a warm glow that would photograph beautifully for the company's social media campaign. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen fireworks above guests who represented a combined net worth that could fund small nations. This wasn't just a charity event, it was a display of power dressed in philanthropy's clothing. Victoria moved through the crowd with the fluid confidence of someone who owned not just the room, but the building, the block, and most of the people in it. Conversations paused as she passed, heads turning in unconscious deference to her presence. She was Sterling Dynamics, and Sterling Dynamics was Hera's $60 billion empire built from code, ambition, and the carefully calculated destruction of anyone who underestimated her. "Victoria, darling." Margaret Chen, CEO of Apex Ventures, glided over in a gown that probably cost as much as a luxury car. Air kisses were exchanged, the kind that never actually made contact, preserving makeup and maintaining the appropriate distance between titans. Stunning event, as always. "You've outdone yourself." "Thank you, Margaret. Though I have to say, your acquisition of Dataflow last month was masterful. Absolutely ruthless in the best possible way." Margaret's laugh was crystalline, sharp. "Coming from you, that's the highest compliment possible." They spoke in the coded language of their world praise, wrapped in subtle threats, admiration laced with competition. It was a dance Victoria had learned early in her career when she realized that showing weakness in rooms like this was the fastest way to find yourself on the outside looking in. She'd clawed her way to the top by being smarter, more ruthless, and more willing to sacrifice than anyone else. Sentiment was a luxury she couldn't afford. The ballroom doors opened with theatrical timing, revealing a space that had been transformed into something beyond mere elegance. The charity auction would begin soon. Original artwork, vintage wines, exclusive experiences that would raise millions for various causes, while serving as a tax write-off for the wealthy. But first, cocktails and the delicate art of networking that kept the wheels of industry turning. Victoria accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, Dom Perignon, because everything tonight was about sending the right message. She surveyed her domain with satisfaction, watching her executives mingle with potential investors, board members courting new partnerships, her carefully orchestrated world spinning exactly as she'd designed it. "Miss Sterling?" The voice came from her left, hesitant but hopeful. Victoria turned, and her expression shifted almost imperceptibly when she saw who had spoken. Marcus Rivera stood a respectful distance away, his janitor's uniform immaculate despite being clearly second-hand. The navy blue shirt was pressed, but showed the kind of wear that came from years of honest work, and his hands clean but permanently stained by chemicals, and labor clasped a small bouquet of grocery store flowers. He was perhaps 50, with graying temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of long nights and longer days. There was something about his posture, though, that refused to bend, despite the circumstances, dignity that sat on his shoulders like an old coat, worn but not discarded. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Marcus continued, his voice carrying a slight accent that suggested Spanish was his first language. "I just wanted to congratulate you on the company's success this quarter. The whole night staff has been talking about it. We're proud to be part of something so—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Important." The conversations around them had slowed, though not stopped entirely. Victoria could feel the attention of nearby guests like heat from a fire. Her board members, major investors, technology journalists who would remember this moment and potentially write about it. Margaret Chen had paused mid-sentence in her conversation with the mayor, her eyebrows raised in obvious curiosity. Victoria's smile never wavered, but something cold crystallized behind her eyes. She looked at Marcus like he was a stain on an otherwise perfect evening, her gaze traveling from his hopeful expression down to the flowers in his work-worn hands and back up again. The assessment took perhaps 3 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice carrying just far enough for those nearby to hear, "but I don't think we've been introduced." The words were polite, but the tone was arctic. She made no move to extend her hand, didn't acknowledge the flowers, didn't even grant him the courtesy of her full attention. Her eyes were already scanning the room as if looking for someone more worthy of her time. Marcus's smile faltered slightly, but he pressed on with the kind of determination that came from years of being overlooked. "Marcus Rivera. I work here nights, cleaning and maintenance. I've been with Sterling Dynamics for 3 years now." "Ah." Victoria's response was flat, dismissive. She took a small sip of her champagne, the pause stretching uncomfortably. Around them, the subtle shift in attention was palpable. Conversations had definitely slowed now, guests sensing drama in the air like sharks scenting blood. "Well, I'm sure the custodial staff appreciates having steady work." The word custodial landed like a slap. Not maintenance, not even cleaning crew custodial, with all its implications of being disposable, forgettable, beneath notice. Marcus's face flushed slightly, but his dignity held firm. "Yes, ma'am, we do." He extended the flowers slightly, a gesture so hopeful it was almost painful to witness. "These are for you, for everything you've built here. My daughter Emma always talks about women who break barriers, and that's very thoughtful." Victoria cut him off, her tone suggesting it was anything but I think there's been some confusion about appropriate workplace boundaries. She didn't reach for the flowers, didn't even look at them directly. Instead, she let her gaze drift past him as if he'd already ceased to exist. "Rachel?" Her assistant appeared instantly, tablet clutched like a shield. "Yes, Miss Sterling? Please remind security about proper protocols for this evening. I think there may have been some miscommunication about access levels." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Marcus's eyes widened slightly. As the full impact hit him, she wasn't just dismissing him, she was threatening his job. The flowers in his hands suddenly seemed absurd, embarrassing, the gesture of a man who'd forgotten his place in the world's carefully constructed hierarchy. James Patterson, Victoria's chief operating officer, had drifted closer during the exchange, his expression carefully neutral but his loyalty clear. "Of course, Victoria. I'll make sure there's no further confusion." Other executives began to gather in a loose semicircle, not quite close enough to appear to be actively watching, but near enough to show solidarity with their CEO. It was pack behavior, the kind of institutional cruelty that happened when people prioritized power over humanity. None of them spoke directly to Marcus, but their body language created a wall around Victoria, reinforcing the message that he didn't belong in their rarefied air. Margaret Chen's expression was harder to read. There was something that might have been discomfort flickering in her eyes, but she said nothing. In their world, challenging Victoria Sterling publicly would be professional suicide, and everyone knew it. Marcus stood there for a moment longer, the flowers still clutched in his hands, like evidence of his own foolishness. The party continued around him, conversations resuming, laughter floating over the string quartet's gentle melody, but he existed in a bubble of humiliation that felt absolute and crushing. "I understand," he said quietly, his voice steady despite everything. "I apologize for the interruption." He didn't grovel, didn't beg, didn't make excuses. He simply nodded once, turned, and walked away with as much dignity as a man could carry, while the most powerful woman in the room watched his retreat with ice-cold satisfaction. Victoria waited until he was well out of earshot before allowing herself a small, dismissive laugh. "Some people simply don't understand boundaries," she said to her gathered executives, her voice carrying just enough volume to ensure the right people heard her. "It's important to maintain proper professional distance, don't you think?" A chorus of agreement rippled through the group. Nervous laughter, nods of approval, the kind of enthusiastic support that came from people terrified of finding themselves on the wrong side of their CEO's displeasure. But there was something hollow in their responses, a performative quality that suggested at least some of them felt uncomfortable with what they'd just witnessed. "Absolutely," James said, his voice perhaps a touch too eager. "Can't have the help getting ideas above their station." The phrase, "the help," landed with particular cruelty, reducing Marcus from a person with a name, a daughter, dreams and struggles, to nothing more than a function invisible, interchangeable, disposable. Victoria smiled approvingly at James's comment, filing away his willingness to participate in the humiliation for future reference. Loyalty demonstrated through cruelty was the most reliable kind. As the evening progressed, the incident was absorbed into the background hum of the gala. Conversations moved on to quarterly projections, merger rumors, the latest Tesla delivery numbers. Wine flowed, checks were written for charity, photographs were taken for the society pages. The machine of wealth and influence continued its relentless operation, grinding forward over whatever obstacles lay in its path. But in the periphery of the grand ballroom, Marcus Rivera continued his work. He emptied trash bins with methodical precision, wiped down surfaces that had been touched by manicured hands, cleaned spills from marble floors that had been walked on by shoes worth more than his monthly rent. He moved through the space like a ghost, unnoticed by guests who had been trained from birth to look through people like him. Yet there was something unbroken in his movements, a quiet pride in his work that Victoria's dismissal hadn't managed to crush. He straightened chairs with care, arranged flowers that had been knocked askew, ensured that every surface gleamed. The flowers he'd brought now, abandoned on a side table, where he'd left them, were simple grocery store daisies, the kind a working man could afford, but they'd been chosen with thought and offered with sincerity. Victoria, meanwhile, held court near the auction display, surrounded by admirers and sycophants, the incident with the janitor already forgotten in her mind. She was discussing the company's expansion into Asian markets when she noticed him again, just a figure in navy blue moving efficiently through the crowd, emptying wastebaskets and refilling water glasses. For a split second, something flickered across her face, not quite recognition, but a momentary awareness of the contradiction between her carefully crafted image as a champion of working families and the casual cruelty with which she'd just treated one of her own employees. But the moment passed quickly, buried under the more immediate concerns of maintaining her position, protecting her image, feeding the endless appetite of an empire that demanded everything and forgave nothing. She turned back to her conversation about market penetration and profit margins. Her conscience, if it had stirred at all, falling silent once again. The string quartet played on, the wine continued to flow, and the most successful charity gala in Sterling Dynamics history proceeded without further interruption. In a few hours, the guests would return to their penthouses and gated communities, the catering staff would clean up, and the building would empty except for the security guards and the night maintenance crew. And Marcus Rivera would continue his work, as he had for 3 years, moving through the halls of power, like a man who understood that dignity wasn't something that could be given or taken away by others. It was something you carried within yourself, invisible but unbreakable, a treasure that no amount of humiliation could touch. The irony was lost on Victoria Sterling, who had built an empire but somehow forgotten what it meant to build a life worth living. She stood at the center of her glittering world, surrounded by wealth and power and influence, yet somehow more alone than the janitor she'd dismissed without a second thought. But that realization, like so many others, would have to wait for another night, another moment, another reckoning that was still hours away from changing everything she thought she knew about success, family, and the true cost of climbing to the top. The ballroom doors burst open with enough force to interrupt even the most self-absorbed conversations. All eyes turned toward the entrance, expecting perhaps a late-arriving dignitary or celebrity guest who'd demand the kind of theatrical entrance that required genuine surprise. Instead, they saw a teenage girl in ripped jeans and a vintage band t-shirt, her dark hair falling in waves around her shoulders, combat boots clicking against marble floors that had only known designer heels and Italian leather. Emma Sterling moved through the crowd like she owned the place, which, technically, she did or would someday, but there was nothing of her mother's calculated grace in her movement. At 16, she carried herself with the kind of raw authenticity that hadn't yet been polished away by years of corporate training and social expectations. Her eyes swept the room, not with Victoria's predatory assessment of value and influence, but with the searching intensity of someone looking for the one person who mattered. Victoria felt her stomach drop the moment she saw her daughter. Emma wasn't supposed to be here, they'd fought about it 3 weeks ago. Another screaming match that had ended with Emma storming out and Victoria throwing herself even deeper into quarterly projections to avoid thinking about the growing chasm between them. 2 years of estrangement had taught Victoria that her daughter's appearances were never accidental, never casual. Emma showed up when she had something to prove or something to destroy. "Oh my God," Margaret Chen whispered, her champagne glass frozen halfway to her lips. "Is that your daughter?" Victoria's practiced smile felt like it might crack her face. Emma has always been dramatic in her fashion choices, but even as she spoke, her eyes were tracking her daughter's movement through the crowd, watching her push past bewildered executives and socialites like they were mannequins in her way. Emma's gaze finally found what it was searching for. Across the ballroom, near the service entrance where he'd been quietly replacing empty water pitchers, Marcus Rivera looked up from his work. His face transformed the moment he saw Hearth's careful mask of professional invisibility falling away to reveal pure, unguarded joy. "Dad!" Emma's voice cut through the string quartet and polite conversation like a blade through silk. She broke into a run, her combat boots echoing against marble as every head in the room turned to follow her path. Victoria's world tilted sideways. The word "Dad" hung in the air like a confession, like an accusation, like a bomb waiting to explode. Around her, she could feel the shift in energy, the sudden sharp attention of everyone who'd witnessed her dismissal of Marcus Rivera just an hour earlier. Conversations died mid-sentence. Champagne glasses paused at lips. The entire ballroom held its breath, Marcus dropped the water pitcher he'd been holding crystal, shattering against marble in a sound that seemed to echo forever, and opened his arms just in time to catch Emma as she launched herself into his embrace. She wrapped her arms around his neck with the desperate intensity of a daughter who'd been separated from her father for too long, and he held her like she was the most precious thing in his world. "Emma," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "What are you doing here, mija?" "I had to see you," she said, pulling back just enough to look at his face. "I got your message about the gala, and I couldn't stand the thought of you being here alone while she—" Emma's eyes found Victoria across the room, and the look she gave her mother was pure ice. "While she pretends you don't exist." The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria could feel every pair of eyes in the room burning into her, could sense the shifting dynamics as people began to connect dots that painted a picture she'd spent years trying to bury. Margaret Chen's expression had moved from curiosity to something approaching horror. James Patterson looked like he might be sick. The society journalists were practically vibrating with the scoop of the decade. Victoria's mind raced, trying to find an angle, a way to spin this that wouldn't destroy everything she'd built. But there was no corporate strategy for this moment, no boardroom maneuver that could undo what was happening in front of 300 of the most influential people in Silicon Valley. "I don't understand," someone whispered loudly enough to be heard. "The janitor is her father? But didn't she just—" She refused to shake his hand, called security on him. The whispers built like a wave, rolling through the crowd with increasing volume and venom. Victoria watched her carefully constructed world crumble in real time, each murmur another crack in the foundation of her reputation. Emma pulled away from Marcus just enough to address the room, her young voice carrying with the kind of clear conviction that comes from absolute moral certainty. "This man," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "is Marcus Rivera. He's been my father in every way that matters since I was 8 years old. He's the one who taught me to ride a bike, helped me with homework, held me when I cried, and never once made me feel like I was less important than a board meeting." Victoria felt something cold and sharp twist in her chest. The words weren't just an introduction, they were an indictment, a public accounting of every moment she'd chosen sterling dynamics over her daughter, every school play she'd missed, every birthday relegated to her assistant's calendar. Marcus placed a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder. "Emma, you don't need to." "Yes, I do." She turned to face Victoria directly, and the similarity between mother and daughter was suddenly unmistakable. The same strong jaw, the same intelligent eyes, the same steel spine. But where Victoria's strength had been hardened into something cold and cutting, Emma's burned with righteous fury. Because apparently, my mother has forgotten that the man she just humiliated is the same man who stepped up when she decided building an empire was more important than raising her daughter. The accusation hit Victoria like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to respond, to defend herself, to regain control of a situation that had spiraled completely beyond her management. But what could she say? That Emma was wrong? That she hadn't missed years of her daughter's life chasing stock prices and market share? That Marcus Rivera wasn't the man who'd sat through parent-teacher conferences while Victoria conquered boardrooms? "Emma," Victoria finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper, "you don't understand the complexities." "I understand perfectly." Emma's words were sharp enough to cut glass. "I understand that you married Marcus when you were building your company and needed a partner who believed in your dreams. I understand that he supported you through every late night, every failed pitch, every setback. And I understand that the minute you didn't need him anymore, the minute his blue-collar background became an embarrassment instead of an asset, you threw him away like he was nothing." The crowd around them had grown larger, drawn by the unfolding drama like spectators to a car crash. Victoria could see phone cameras being discreetly raised, could imagine the headlines already being crafted. "Tech CEO humiliates ex, husband at charity gala. Sterling dynasty built on broken family, the true cost of Silicon Valley's success." Marcus stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Emma, that's enough. This isn't the place." "When is the place?" Emma whirled to face him, tears now streaming down her cheeks. When you're working 3 jobs to pay for my college because she won't even acknowledge you exist? When you're cleaning the offices of the company you helped her build from nothing? When she's giving interviews about the importance of family values while treating you like you're invisible? Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. 3 jobs. She hadn't known about the 3 jobs. In fact, she'd carefully avoided knowing anything about Marcus's life after their divorce, had instructed her lawyers to handle everything, had built walls of silence and legal documents to ensure she never had to confront what her choices had cost him. The memory hit her like a tsunami, washing over her with devastating clarity. Marcus at 25, paint-stained and exhausted from his construction job, coming home to their tiny apartment to find her hunched over her laptop, coding until her eyes burned. He'd never complained about the ramen dinners, or the second-hand furniture, or the fact that every penny went toward her startup. He'd believed in her vision even when she'd stopped believing in herself. "You built this company together?" Emma continued, her voice breaking. "He worked construction during the day to pay the bills and helped you debug code at night. He believed in Sterling Dynamics before anyone else did, including you. And the minute you became successful enough to be embarrassed by him, you erased him like he never existed." Victoria remembered the divorce proceedings cold, clinical, designed to minimize her financial exposure and protect her growing company's assets. She justified it as business, as necessary protection for the empire she was building. But standing here now, watching Marcus hold their daughter with a love she'd forgotten how to express, she began to understand the true cost of those calculated decisions. "The restraining order," someone whispered nearby, and Victoria's blood turned to ice. She took out a restraining order against her own husband. Margaret Chen's face had gone pale. "Victoria, tell me that's not true." But it was true, and everyone in the room was beginning to understand the full scope of what they were witnessing. The restraining order that had kept Marcus away from company events, away from their daughter's school functions, away from any social circle where Victoria might have to acknowledge his existence. It had been framed as necessary protection against a bitter ex-husband, but the truth was, Ugly Eric had been a tool to erase an inconvenient past. He never fought it, Emma said, her voice now barely controlled. "Even when it meant he couldn't come to my graduation, couldn't walk me down the aisle someday, couldn't be part of any moment where she might have to see him. He let her destroy his reputation, let her paint him as some kind of threat, because he knew fighting back would hurt me more than it would hurt her." Marcus's face was etched with pain, but not for himself, for Emma, for the daughter who was sacrificing her own relationship with her mother to defend him. "Mija, please, this isn't what I want." "What you want?" Emma laughed, but there was no humor in it. "When has anyone in this family ever cared what you want? You've spent 8 years being the father she refused to be, and she just treated you like dirt in front of everyone who matters in her world." Victoria stood frozen in the center of the storm, watching her past and present collide with nuclear force. The executives who'd laughed at Marcus's dismissal now looked anywhere but at her face. The society photographers were documenting every moment of her destruction, and somewhere in the crowd she could hear the sound of her carefully constructed reputation cracking like ice under pressure. "I don't expect anything from her," Marcus said quietly, his arm still around Emma's shoulders. "I never have. But you deserve better than carrying this anger, Mija. You deserve a relationship with your mother." "She made her choice," Emma replied, wiping tears from her cheeks. "She chose money over family, success over love, image over truth. And now everyone knows exactly who Victoria Sterling really is." The words hung in the air like a verdict, final and devastating. Victoria looked around the room at faces that had once held respect, admiration, even fear. Now she saw disgust, disappointment, the kind of judgment that came from witnessing someone's true character in a moment of crisis. But it was Marcus's face that destroyed her, not angry, not vindictive, just infinitely sad. He looked at her with the same expression he'd worn 8 years ago when she'd served him with divorce papers, when she'd chosen her company's future over their family's past. It was the look of a man who'd loved someone completely, and watched them transform into someone he no longer recognized. Victoria opened her mouth to speak, to explain, to somehow undo the damage that couldn't be undone. But before she could find words for the impossible, Emma took Marcus's hand and began walking toward the exit, leaving her mother standing alone in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by the ruins of everything she'd thought mattered. The silence that followed their departure was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of Emma's combat boots echoing down the marble hallway, the same hallway where Marcus would continue his work long after the guests had gone home, long after the champagne glasses had been cleared away, long after Victoria Sterling had learned that some victories cost everything worth winning. The silence shattered like glass hitting concrete. What had been absolute quiet erupted into a cacophony of whispers, gasps, and the subtle but unmistakable sound of 300 guests simultaneously reaching for their phones. Victoria stood paralyzed in the center of the ballroom, watching her world implode in real time as conversations exploded around her like grenades. Did you hear what she said about the restraining order? 3 jobs she's working, 3 jobs while she's worth billions? The janitor is her ex-husband, the father of her child? She just humiliated her own daughter's father in front of everyone. Someone get this on video. Victoria's practiced composure cracked like a dam under pressure. The faces surrounding her had transformed from respectful admiration to something far more dangerous judgment mixed with the predatory excitement that came from witnessing a titan fall. These were people who'd spent their careers climbing over the wreckage of others' failures, and now they smelled blood in the water. Margaret Chen was the first to approach, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes sharp with calculation. "Victoria, darling, perhaps we should discuss this privately." But even as she spoke, Margaret was already mentally crafting the story she'd tell at tomorrow's board meeting, already positioning herself to benefit from Victoria's inevitable downfall. "There's nothing to discuss," Victoria managed, her voice barely steady. But the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. How could she explain 8 years of calculated cruelty? How could she justify treating the father of her child like he was invisible while preaching family values in corporate interviews? James Patterson materialized at her elbow, his face pale with the understanding that his own career was now tied to a sinking ship. "Victoria, we need to get you out of here. Rachel's already working on a statement." "A statement?" The voice cut through the crowd like a knife, and Victoria's heart stopped. Emma had returned, pushing through the cluster of executives and socialites with Marcus trailing behind her, his face etched with resignation and something that might have been pity. What possible statement could justify what just happened? Emma's voice carried across the ballroom, and conversations died as guests turned to witness the next act in this devastating drama. What spin could possibly explain why my mother just treated my father like garbage in front of everyone who matters in her world? Victoria's training, kicked in years of hostile boardrooms and media crises, had taught her to compartmentalize, to find the angle that would minimize damage and protect her position. "Emma, you're upset and you're not thinking clearly. This is a complicated situation that you don't fully understand." "Complicated?" Emma's laugh was sharp enough to cut. "What's complicated about it? You built a company with his help, got rich off his support, then threw him away when he became inconvenient. You took out a restraining order to keep him away from me, then had the audacity to give interviews about the importance of work-life balance." The crowd pressed closer, drawn by the raw authenticity of Emma's fury and the spectacular destruction of one of Silicon Valley's most carefully constructed reputations. Phone cameras were recording now, openly and without shame. By tomorrow, this moment would be viral, analyzed by media outlets and business schools as a case study in how quickly empire could turn to ashes. "You want to know why I hate coming to these things?" Emma continued, her voice rising. "Because I have to watch you accept awards for being a successful woman while the man who actually raised me can't even get an invitation. I have to listen to you talk about mentoring young women while you destroyed the one man who believed in your dreams before anyone else did." Victoria felt something crack inside her chest. "Emma, I never meant for you to..." "To what? To see who you really are?" Emma's eyes blazed with righteous fury. Do you know what he does with the money from those 3 jobs? Half of it goes to my college fund because you cut off my trust fund when I wouldn't pretend he didn't exist. The other half goes to a scholarship fund for kids whose parents work in the service industry, because even after everything you've done to him, he still believes in helping people climb out of the kind of poverty you threw him back into. The revelation hit the crowd like a physical blow. Murmurs rippled through the ballroom scholarship fund. Trust fund cut off. The growing understanding that Victoria Sterling had been systematically punishing her own daughter for refusing to abandon her father. Margaret Chen's carefully neutral expression finally cracked. Victoria, you cut off your daughter's trust fund? That's note it wasn't meant as punishment, Victoria stammered, but the words sounded pathetic even to her own ears. How could she explain that she'd seen Emma's loyalty to Marcus as betrayal, as choosing sides in a war that only she had been fighting? Then what was it? Emma shot back. What was it when you had me removed from the company's family insurance plan? What was it when you told grandmother's lawyers I wasn't to inherit anything if I maintained contact with Marcus? What was it when you tried to have my last name legally changed so no one would connect me to him? Each revelation landed like a physical blow, not just on Victoria but on the crowd of guests who were witnessing the systematic destruction of everything they thought they knew about one of their own. The woman who gave speeches about corporate responsibility had spent 8 years destroying her own family with the same ruthless efficiency she brought to hostile takeovers. Marcus stepped forward, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the suddenly silent ballroom. Emma, that's enough. No, it's not enough. Emma whirled to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks. You've protected her for 8 years. Let her rewrite history. Let her make you the villain in a story where you're the only one who acted with any decency. Mija. Marcus's voice was gentle but firm. This isn't about me. This was never about me. He looked past Emma to Victoria, and for a moment, the crowd faded away. It was just the two of them, former lovers who'd built something beautiful together and watched it crumble under the weight of ambition and pride. You think I took this job to torment you? Marcus said, his words carrying just far enough for the nearest guest to hear. You think I applied to Sterling Dynamics out of spite or some desire for revenge? But the truth is simpler than that. He paused, his eyes never leaving Victoria's face. This was the only place I could work where I might occasionally see our daughter. The admission hit Victoria like a sledgehammer. All these years, she'd assumed his presence in her building was calculated harassment, a reminder of a past she'd tried to erase. But he'd taken a job cleaning her offices, job that paid a fraction of what he'd once earned, just for the chance to catch glimpses of Emma at company events, to exist in the same space as the daughter he'd been legally forbidden to contact. The restraining order doesn't apply during work hours, Marcus continued, his voice steady despite the pain etched in every line of his face. I'm allowed to be in the same building as long as I don't approach either of you directly. So I took the job, and I've spent 3 years mopping floors and emptying trash cans, hoping maybe Emma would come to a corporate event, maybe I'd see her grow up from a distance. Victoria felt her knees weaken. She reached for a nearby chair, her carefully constructed world tilting on its axis. Marcus, I didn't know. You didn't want to know. His words were quiet but devastating. You built walls so high you couldn't see over them anymore. You turned me into a ghost, then acted surprised when I started haunting the only place you couldn't completely erase me from. Emma's sobs were audible now, her anger giving way to grief for the father who'd sacrificed everything just to exist in her orbit. Around them, the crowd of guests stood frozen, witnessing something more intimate and devastating than any corporate scandal, the complete collapse of a family built on love and destroyed by pride. I gave interviews about the importance of family values, Victoria whispered, the words barely audible. I gave speeches about supporting working families while you were working 3 jobs to pay for our daughter's education. Yes, Marcus said simply. You did. The hypocrisy was so absolute, so devastating, that even Victoria's most loyal executives began to distance themselves. James Patterson took a subtle step backward, Rachel clutched her tablet like a shield, already mentally drafting her resignation. The board members who'd supported Victoria through every crisis were calculating the political cost of continued association. Margaret Chen's voice cut through the tension like a scalpel. "Victoria, I think it's best if you step away from the microphone tonight. Perhaps James could handle the charity auction portion of the evening." It was a gentle coup, executed with the surgical precision that came from years of boardroom politics. Victoria was being removed from her own event, at her own gala, in her own building. The message was clear. The tech elite were already writing her obituary, already positioning themselves for a world without Victoria Sterling at its center. "You want to know the worst part?" Emma's voice was quiet now, drained of its earlier fury, but somehow more devastating for its calm precision. "He still loves you. After everything you've done, after 8 years of systematic cruelty, he still asks about you. Still hopes maybe someday you'll remember who you used to be before the money and power made you forget what actually matters." Victoria looked at Marcus, searching his face for denial, for anger, for anything other than the quiet acceptance she found there. But Emma was right there, was still love in his eyes, worn down by years of disappointment but somehow unbroken. It was the same look he'd given her 20 years ago when she'd been afraid to pitch her first investor, when she doubted her own vision. He'd believed in her then, and some part of him still believed in her now, despite everything. "I became everything I used to hate," Victoria said, the words torn from somewhere deep in her chest. "I became my father." The admission hung in the air like a confession. Victoria's father had been a corporate raider, a man who destroyed companies and families with equal coldness, who'd taught her that sentiment was weakness and loyalty was a liability. She'd sworn she'd be different, that her success would be built on different principles. But somewhere along the way, she'd absorbed his lessons, internalized his cruelty, become the thing she'd spent her youth rebelling against. Marcus stepped closer, and for a moment the crowd held its breath. "You're not him," he said quietly. "You're lost, but you're not him. He never loved anyone enough to lose himself over them." The words were meant as comfort, but they cut deeper than any accusation. Because they revealed the truth Victoria had been running from for 8 years, that she'd destroyed her family not because she didn't love them, but because she'd loved her ambition more. Emma wiped her tears with the back of her hand, her young face already showing signs of the weariness that came from carrying adult burdens. "I'm done," she said quietly. "I'm done watching you destroy yourself and everyone who loves you. I'm done hoping you'll remember what it felt like to be human." She turned to Marcus, taking his arm with the protective gesture of a daughter who'd learned too young that love meant standing between the people you cared about and the forces that would destroy them. "Come on, Dad. Let's go home." As they walked toward the exit, the crowd parted like the Red Sea, creating a path of shame that Victoria would have to watch them travel. She stood frozen, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything but witness the final destruction of everything that had ever mattered. The ballroom erupted again as the door closed behind them, voices raised in shocked conversation, phones buzzing with messages, the sound of a reputation being dissected in real time. But Victoria heard none of it. She stood alone in the center of her empire, surrounded by crystal and gold and the hollow trappings of a success that had cost her everything worth having. Margaret Chen approached one final time, her voice professionally sympathetic but personally cold. "Victoria, I think it's best if you leave now. Let us handle the rest of the evening." And for the first time in 20 years, Victoria Sterling, CEO, visionary destroyer of worlds, did exactly what someone else told her to do. She walked through her own gala like a stranger, past guests who whispered and pointed, past photographers who documented her fall, past the life she'd built on the bones of the family she'd destroyed. The exit had never seemed so far away, or the cost of reaching it so impossibly high. The Sterling Dynamics building stood like a monument to ambition against the midnight sky, its glass facade reflecting the city lights in fractured patterns that seemed to mock Victoria's shattered world. She sat in the back of her Bentley for 20 minutes after her driver had pulled up to the curb, staring at the tower that bore her name, the empire she'd built from code and ruthless calculation. The gala had ended hours ago, but she couldn't bring herself to go home to her penthouse, a $30 million mausoleum filled with awards and achievements that suddenly felt as hollow as museum pieces. The building's lobby was empty except for the security guard, who nodded respectfully as she passed. He probably hadn't heard about the gala yet, hadn't seen the videos that were already spreading across social media like wildfire. By tomorrow, everyone would know. By Monday, the board would be calling emergency meetings. By next week, she might not have a company left to lose. Victoria's heels echoed against marble floors as she made her way to the elevator bank, each step a reminder of the distance between who she was now and who she'd been when this building was just a dream sketched on napkins in a studio apartment she'd shared with Marcus. The elevator rose silently toward the executive floors, carrying her past the life she'd built on the ruins of the love she'd destroyed. But she didn't press the button for the 52nd floor, didn't head to her corner office with its floor-to-ceiling windows and view of a city she'd conquered. Instead, she found herself pressing B3, the basement level, where the maintenance staff kept their equipment, where the real work of keeping her empire running happened in shadows and silence. The elevator doors opened onto a fluorescent-lit corridor that smelled of industrial cleaner and honest work. Victoria had never been down here before. In 20 years of owning this building, she'd never descended below the parking garage. It was a different world, painted in utilitarian gray and filled with the mechanical hum of HVAC systems and water heaters that kept her glass tower habitable. She found him in the main maintenance room, bent over a large sink, methodically cleaning equipment with the same careful attention he'd once brought to debugging her code 20 years ago. Marcus had changed out of his uniform into jeans and a worn flannel shirt, but his movements still carried that quiet precision she remembered, the way he approached every task like it mattered, like it deserved his full attention. He didn't turn when the door opened, didn't seem surprised by her presence. "Shouldn't you be celebrating?" he asked, his voice neutral as he continued scrubbing a mop handle. The auction raised $8 million. Best charity gala in company history. Victoria stood in the doorway, her Valentino gown absurdly out of place in the basement workshop. "How long have you known I knew?" Marcus paused in his work, his shoulders tightening almost imperceptibly. "Known what?" "That you worked here. That you've been here for 3 years." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I approved your hiring. Your application crossed my desk." He set down the mop and turned slowly, his face unreadable in the harsh fluorescent light. "I wondered if you'd remember. You sign a lot of things." "I remember everything, Marcus. I always have." Victoria stepped into the room, her heels clicking against concrete floors that had never known Italian leather. "I remember the day your application came in. I remember staring at your name on the paper for 10 minutes before I signed the approval." He leaned against the sink, arms crossed, studying her with the same intensity he'd once brought to understanding her dreams. "Then you know I didn't take this job to hurt you." "I know. The admission cost her something vital." "I know, and I let you take it anyway. I could have rejected your application, could have made sure you never set foot in this building, but I didn't." "Why?" Victoria looked around the room at the cleaning supplies and maintenance equipment, at the world that kept her empire functioning while remaining completely invisible to her. "Because some part of me thought I deserved to be haunted." The silence stretched between them like a chasm 20 years in the making. Marcus studied her face, searching for something truth, perhaps, or the woman he'd once known beneath the armor of success and cruelty. "Do you know what the worst part was?" he asked finally, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear it. "Not the divorce, not the restraining order, not even losing Emma. It was watching you succeed." Victoria felt something sharp twist in her chest. "Marcus, every magazine cover, every award, every interview where you talked about your vision and your values. I watched all of it. I'd come home from my construction job or later from this place, and I'd see you on the news, and I'd remember the woman who used to wake up at 3 in the morning with ideas she had to code before she forgot them." He pushed away from the sink, moving to a workbench where tools lay arranged with military precision. I was proud of you. Even after everything. Even when you were systematically destroying our daughter's relationship with me, I was proud of what you'd built. The words hit Victoria like physical blows. She'd spent 8 years assuming Marcus hated her, that he watched her success with bitterness and resentment. The reality was so much worse. He'd continued to love her, continued to believe in her, even as she'd transformed into someone unrecognizable. I used to clean your office, Marcus continued, his hands moving restlessly over the tools. Not always, but sometimes. I'd empty your trash, dust your awards, clean the windows you stare out of while making decisions that affect thousands of people, and I'd wonder if you ever thought about the cost of the view. Victoria's throat felt raw, like she'd been screaming for hours. What cost? Everything, Victoria. Everything that used to matter to you. He turned to face her fully, and she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of carrying 8 years of grief and disappointment. You used to cry when you had to fire someone, even when they deserved it. You used to stay up all night when an employee's child was sick, trying to figure out how to help without making them feel like charity cases. I still care about my employees. You refused to shake my hand in front of 300 people. His words were quiet but devastating. You called security on a man holding grocery store flowers who wanted to congratulate you on your success. That woman I fell in love with would have been horrified by what you've become. Victoria felt tears she hadn't shed in years burning behind her eyes. I built this company for us, for our family. Everything I did was supposed to create a better life. No, Marcus's voice was firm but not angry. You built this company instead of us, instead of our family. You chose stock prices over school plays, board meetings over bedtime stories, conquering markets over being conquered by love. The truth of it hit her like a physical force. She'd spent 8 years telling herself that her success had been for Emma, that the empire she'd built would someday benefit their daughter. But the reality was simpler and more devastating. She'd built Sterling Dynamics to fill the void left by the family she'd abandoned, and in doing so, had made that void impossibly deep. When did I become the villain in my own story? Victoria whispered. Marcus's expression softened, just slightly. When you started believing your own press releases. When you convinced yourself that being powerful was the same thing as being right. Victoria looked around the maintenance room again, seeing it clearly for the first time. This was where the real work happened, not in boardrooms, where people in expensive suits made decisions about other people's lives, but in places like this, where those decisions played out in reality. Marcus kept her empire running with the same quiet dedication he'd once brought to their marriage, asking for nothing in return except the dignity of honest work. I don't know how to fix this, she admitted, her voice breaking on the words. I don't know how to undo 8 years of being someone I hate. You can't undo it, Marcus said simply. But you can stop doing it. Victoria felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been frozen for so long she'd forgotten it existed. Emma will never forgive me. Emma loves you. She always has. But she can't love someone who doesn't exist anymore. Marcus moved closer, and for a moment, Victoria caught a glimpse of the man who'd held her while she'd cried over failed pitches and impossible dreams. The question is whether there's anything left of the woman she used to know. Victoria closed her eyes, remembering the woman she'd been at 25, broke, ambitious, terrified of failure but more terrified of never trying. That woman had believed in love as much as success, had thought she could have both if she just worked hard enough. That woman had been naive, perhaps, but she'd been real. If I step down, Victoria said slowly, if I walk away from Sterling Dynamics, what guarantee do I have that Emma will give me another chance? What guarantee do I have that you will? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed and raw. No guarantees? He said finally. That's what makes it a choice, instead of a transaction. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria had spent 20 years building a world where she controlled every variable, where success could be calculated and failure could be prevented through careful planning and ruthless execution. But love, real love, Had no spreadsheets, no projections, no guaranteed return on investment. "The board is meeting Monday," she said more to herself than to him. "Emergency session to discuss my future with the company. They'll force me out anyway after tonight. Will they?" Victoria looked at him sharply. "You saw what happened. The videos are already online. My reputation is destroyed." "Your reputation as an untouchable corporate ice queen is destroyed," Marcus corrected. "But reputations can be rebuilt. The question is what kind of reputation you want to build." Victoria felt the weight of the choice settling on her shoulders like a physical thing. She could hire the best PR firms, craft a narrative of misunderstood family dynamics, position herself as a victim of a vindictive ex-husband and troubled teenager. She had the resources, the connections, the sheer force of will to weather this storm and emerge scarred but intact. Or she could let go. She could walk away from everything she'd built, step down from the empire that bore her name, and try to become someone worthy of her daughter's love again. "If I choose Emma," Victoria said quietly, "if I choose family over the company, I lose everything I've worked for." "No," Marcus replied, his voice gentle but certain. "If you choose the company over Emma, you lose everything that matters." Victoria looked at him standing there in his work clothes, surrounded by the tools and equipment that kept her world functioning, and finally understood what she'd been too blind to see for 8 years. Marcus Rivera had more dignity in his work boots than she'd ever had in her corner office. He'd found honor in service, meaning in sacrifice, richness in relationships, while she'd built an empire on isolation and fear. The choice crystallized in her mind with sudden, devastating clarity. She could continue climbing a ladder that led nowhere, or she could step down and try to build something real. Victoria pulled her phone from her clutch with trembling hands. The screen showed 47 missed calls, hundreds of text messages, a digital avalanche of crisis management and damage control. But she ignored all of it, scrolling instead to a contact she hadn't called in 8 years. Emma's phone went straight to voicemail, which wasn't surprising given that it was past midnight and her daughter probably never wanted to speak to her again. But Victoria didn't hang up when the beep sounded. Instead, she took a breath and began to speak. "Emma, it's me. I know you probably don't want to hear my voice right now, and I don't blame you. I've spent 8 years being someone you shouldn't have to love, someone I wouldn't want to love either." Her voice cracked, but she continued. "I want you to know that I'm stepping down from Sterling Dynamics. Effective Monday morning. I'm resigning as CEO and transferring my majority stake to a trust that will benefit the employees, including your father, who actually keep this company running." Victoria looked at Marcus, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I don't know if this changes anything between us. I don't know if you can ever forgive me for throwing away our family to build something that never loved me back. But I want you to know that I remember who I used to be, and I want to try to find her again." She paused, tears finally spilling over despite her attempts to maintain control. "I love you, Emma. I've loved you every day for 16 years, even when I was too broken to show it properly. And I love your father, even though I spent 8 years proving I didn't deserve him. If you ever want to give me another chance to know as a CEO or a success story, but just as a woman who lost her way and wants to come home, I'll be here." Victoria ended the call and slipped the phone back into her clutch. The silence in the maintenance room was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of machinery keeping her empire alive. "You really meant it?" Marcus asked quietly. "You're walking away from everything?" Victoria looked around the room one last time at the concrete walls and fluorescent lights, at the man who'd spent 3 years cleaning up after her ambition while she'd convinced herself she was conquering the world. "Not everything," she said softly. "I'm walking toward the only things that were ever real." Marcus nodded slowly, and for just a moment Victoria thought she saw something flicker in his eyes. Not forgiveness. Not yet, but possibility. The possibility that redemption wasn't about grand gestures or perfect endings, but about choosing love over fear, family over empire, becoming someone worthy of a second chance, even when you didn't deserve one. Victoria Sterling had built a tower that scraped the sky, had conquered markets and destroyed competitors, had accumulated wealth and power beyond most people's wildest dreams. But standing in a basement maintenance room at 2 in the morning, talking to the man whose love she'd traded for success, she finally understood what victory really looked like. It looked like stepping down from a pedestal she'd never deserved to stand on, and hoping against all evidence and reason that there might still be time to build something that would last longer than stock prices and quarterly reports. It looked like choosing to be human again, even when being powerful had been so much easier. The choice was made. Now came the harder part, learning to live with it, and discovering whether love could indeed conquer all, or whether some bridges were too burned to ever rebuild. Victoria Sterling, former CEO, former empress of a digital kingdom, former stranger to her own heart, walked toward the elevator that would carry her back to the world above. But for the first time in 8 years, she wasn't climbing toward something. She was coming home.